Okay, hello everyone. I'm Tom Secker. I use open source research methods to investigate intelligence services, secret services. Is it going? Awesome. And so here we are. Open source intelligence. What connects the Walsall Anarchists, Nazi Pigeons and Ben Affleck? A question for the ages. Okay. Better? Awesome. So, who were the Walsall Anarchists? They were, of course, anarchists from Walsall, which is a town in England. And these were a bunch of men who, back in the 1890s, were set up by Special Branch, the British Secret Security Police, to look like terrorists. They were fitted up. They were victims of a miscarriage of justice. 6 were arrested, 4 were convicted and sent to prison. And as I say, this happened in the late Victorian period. The context of all of this, of course, was the rise of the international labour movement, which in the 19th century became very, very important, and in particular the rise of Marxist philosophy criticising industrial capitalism and anarchist philosophy criticising the modernist nation-state. And we could in fact call this open source political philosophy, because these books were being printed en masse, people were reading them en masse, people were digesting these ideas and discussing them in the talking shops of the day. However, we also got the philosophy of propaganda of the deed, which is this notion that only massive, catastrophic, violent acts would cause societal change, and this is something that many of the anarchists actually embraced. So, we got the first so-called Red Terror. The anarchists managed to assassinate, in a period of 20 years, the leaders of Russia, France, Austria, Italy, and the United States. And there were many other assassinations and assassination attempts of leaders of nation-states at that time. So this was serious. This was something the establishment had to respond to. Their own people were getting killed. This new emerging threat was also, let's say, illustrated and manifested in fiction. This is a picture from a 1893 novel portraying the destruction of London, the destruction of the Houses of Parliament, the very centre of the modernist empire of the day. In another novel, a few years later, if you look in the top right of this image, you will see a hijacked aircraft, and this is attacking skyscrapers in New York City. This is, again, a book from 1910, depicting a scenario which, of course, today we are all terribly familiar with. So what was the British state's response to this? First, mass infiltration of the anarchist movement. Hundreds and hundreds of people within these movements were actually spies working for either the British or other Western security services. They turned the Special Irish Branch into Special Branch. It was originally set up to counter the militants and radicals who were struggling for Irish independence, and so they expanded it to encompass the anarchists as well. And the anarchist bomb plot, the Walsall anarchist bomb plot, was set up by an agent provocateur. And that man was Auguste Guillaud. He worked as a spy for Special Branch under a man called William Melville. Melville was his handler, was the man running him. And after the Walsall anarchists were arrested, Guillaud's brother actually publicly admitted, this guy's a spy. This guy's been working secretly with the police. At the trial of the Walsall anarchists, letters from Auguste Guillaud to the defendants were used as evidence against them, and these letters contained diagrams for bomb making, recipes for explosives, and exhortations to, carry out acts of violence, to carry out bombings. But Guillaud himself was never arrested. He never stood trial for this, even though he was absolutely central to the plot. When the defendants tried to ask William Melville at the trial questions about this man, saying, who was he? Why wasn't he arrested? Why isn't he stood here next to us on, trying to defend himself? Melville refused to answer the questions. As a result, the men were convicted. The judge supported Melville. He didn't force him to answer the questions, so the men had no defence. They were convicted. A couple of years later, a Special Branch detective called Patrick McIntyre was fired from his job for some kind of illicit affair or some sort. And he published his memoirs in Reynolds' newspaper in 1895, and thus became one of the first Secret Service or intelligence service whistleblowers, now something we're very familiar with, but this guy was perhaps the prototype. And among the various things he described in this memoir was how Melville had used Auguste Coulon to set up the Walsall Anarchists. He described the plot in detail and was uncompromising about it. He said, "This was a setup, this was a miscarriage of justice." Coulon was so upset by this that he actually wrote into the newspaper to complain. Remarkably enough, they printed the letter, and he disputed a few minor details of what McIntyre had been saying, but ultimately he admitted, "I offered my services to the Yard, and they accepted." And this is historic. This is a man working as a secret agent for the British police, writing into a British newspaper to say, "I'm a spy." Crazy. Despite this admission, and despite Coulon basically telling everyone, "Yep, it's true, you got me," the British establishment, the British police, covered the whole thing up for over a century. Even after the British government passed a Freedom of Information Act in the late 1990s, Special Branch continued to refuse Freedom of Information requests for information about this case. Over 100 years later, they were still refusing to say what was going on here. In particular, people were trying to get ledgers or account books, basically, that detailed payments from the police to their various spies and informants. And the police said, "Oh no, we've lost them," or "they were destroyed in a flood," or, you know, the same sorts of excuses we hear from the British state about pretty much everything that they don't want to make public. However, a couple of years after the police refused these Freedom of Information requests, a former counter-terrorism detective at New Scotland Yard, a man called Lindsay Clutterbuck, submitted a PhD thesis to the University of Portsmouth. And among the sources he'd managed to use for this PhD thesis were the very ledgers, the very account books, that the police had said they'd either lost or destroyed. This man managed to find them in the archives. So, they couldn't find them in response to a FOIA request, but an ex-detective just managed to find them lying around. And among the things that Clutterbuck's thesis detailed was Auguste Coulon's history as a police spy. So this is Coulon's history. He was recruited in 1890. He was known under the pseudonym Pyatt. He was an informant until 1904. So for 14 years, this man was working undercover as a secret agent for the British police. And just to put that in context, that's 9 years after he had written into a newspaper to admit that he was doing this. He was still on the payroll. So they they clearly didn't care that much that he'd openly admitted this was going on. The records also show that he got a bonus in early 1892. It says, in connection with the Walsall bomb case. So obviously he was being rewarded for his role in setting up these innocent men. And also, interestingly enough, Jean Patola, one of the men who was arrested and convicted as part of this bomb plot, his wife was actually paid some money in 1902-03, approximately when he was getting out of prison, which suggests that she too may have been on the Special Branch payroll. So why does this matter? Why does some obscure miscarriage of justice from over 100 years ago matter so much to me, and why am I trying to persuade you that it should matter to you? Well, most of this focuses on William Melville himself. He was a senior detective in Special Branch at the time, but then in 1903 he faked his own retirement. He pretended that he was no longer involved with the British security establishment, but what he actually did was take up a job as the first head of the Secret Service Bureau, which is the institution that became MI5. Now Melville Melville trained the first generation of MI5 officers in the UK in the tactics of deception, espionage, provocation, entrapment. So the entire culture of MI5 came from a man who indisputably set up a bunch of innocent people to look like terrorists. So you might say, it's no surprise that this is still going on. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Walsall Anarchists, I can direct you to Scotland Yard, Its Mysteries and Methods. This is Patrick McIntyre's whistleblowing memoir that you can find online. I obtained a copy from an independent researcher, and so obviously it's on my website for free. You could also look at the Lindsay Clutterbuck thesis, which is available on the British Library website, and as a result also available on my website. A couple of books that I would also direct your attention to. MI5's First Spy Master. That is a biography of William Melville that details his whole life and history working for the British security establishment. Also, The World That Never Was, a true story of dreamers, schemers, anarchists and secret agents, which is a wonderful, lyrical, poetic version of the story of what happened in the whole anarchist movement around the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. The seminal book on the history of the British anarchists is called The Slow Burning Fuse by a man called John Quayle. You can also find that online. I'd also suggest you look up it's a sort of pamphlet really, a short expose written at the time by a guy called David Nicoll, called The Walsall Anarchists Trapped by the Police. And he, rather like I am doing today, tried to expose the British establishment and tried to say, you know, these men are innocent, they don't deserve to be in prison. As a result, he himself was imprisoned. He was locked up for writing inflammatory articles. And you can actually find records of his trial via the Old Bailey Online website. Skipping forward 50 years, the Nazi Pigeons. These were, of course, pigeons who worked for the Nazis, primarily as carrier pigeons for military intelligence, but also for other information. And of course, this was going on during World War II. A little context for you. Pigeons had been used in warfare for decades at that point, not just for message carrying, but also for battlefield surveillance. As you can see in the image, you would get your pigeon, attach a small camera to the front, send it up in the air, it would take pictures of the battlefield, land, you develop the pictures, and you have more or less real-time surveillance of the battlefield circumstances. And of course, in the days before surveillance drones and satellite photography, this was very important. They didn't have the technology to do this otherwise. Interesting little fact for you, Heinrich Himmler, the notorious SS officer, was president of the German National Pigeon Society, and in fact every single pigeon in Germany during World War II was working for the Nazis. Every last one had been co-opted by Heinrich Himmler. For their own part, the British had an air force of 250,000 birds. So this was a serious, large-scale situation that was going on. This wasn't just some trivial little trend. Taken very seriously, these are two posters from the British Ministry of Defence, exhorting people not to shoot or molest or wound the homing pigeons and the carrier pigeons. Obviously, the one on the left is more emotive, the one on the right is more of a threat. And that, I suppose, is the division of World War II propaganda, and indeed you could say continues to be the division in propaganda today. So what were they concerned about? Why were MI5 so worried about the Nazi pigeons? Obviously they're not to scale. They had intelligence that there was a build-up in Nazi pigeon activity along the south coast of Britain, the north coast of Europe, and they were worried that these pigeons were being used to communicate with German agents inside Britain, that they were being flown in to pick up secret messages and then being flown back out again. So what did they do about it? They trained an elite group of peregrine falcons to, as an interceptor, I'm not making this up, as an interceptor unit to come in and strike the Nazi pigeons and pluck them out of the air. However, it wasn't very successful. This is from the MI5 file on the Nazi pigeons and the Falcon unit, and it notes, they never brought down an enemy bird, probably because there never were any. In truth, this was a complete fantasy. There never were any Nazi pigeons being used to communicate with agents inside Britain, so the whole thing was just a sort of, like I say, a paranoid fantasy cooked up by MI5. In fact, the only two German pigeons that were ever discovered in Britain at this time came here by accident. They were blew across in a storm. Not here, sorry. and from the UK. The only two that were ever found in the UK went there by accident. They were blown across there in a storm, and they were captured by the security services and turned. They became double pigeons. And as the MI5 file notes, both birds are now prisoners of war, working hard breeding English pigeons. The British also came up with a deceptive ruse to try and cause trouble to the Nazi pigeon apparatus. They realised that they could solder ankle bracelets. Carrier pigeons have bracelets on their ankles with serial numbers on. So they disguised them as German pigeons by putting on bracelets with German serial numbers, then sent them over to Germany to cause as much trouble as possible. The idea being the Germans would find the imposters and, get all carried away and think, oh no, we've got to re-vet all of our pigeon corps and make sure that there aren't any more imposters. Again, this didn't work very well because the Germans never discovered the false flag pigeons. I'd like to say that this madness finished at the end of World War II, but it didn't. MI5 established a committee to discuss the post-war pigeon policy. Among the various things that they talked about included launching pigeons from high-speed aircraft, and quite horrifyingly, using pigeons as suicide troops, either to attack enemy searchlights or even, and again I'm not making this up, to deliver biological weapons. The idea that they would set loose a couple of thousands of pigeons loaded up with anthrax. Crazy, but they were taking this seriously. They never seemed to consider the implications of this. For their own part, the Americans wanted to get in on this, and they came up with Project Pigeon, which was a design for a pigeon-guided missile, whereby the pigeon would be placed in the warhead, in the guidance mechanism at the front of the missile, and would peck at the controls in order to try and direct it to its target. This is a page from Guy Liddell's diary. Guy Liddell was the post-war deputy head of MI5, and he describes a meeting with Captain Kager, the man responsible for running the post-war pigeon unit, and they talked about the homing instinct that pigeons have, which is, in truth, a remarkable phenomenon. And the diary notes, in a sunspot year, all pigeons go haywire. Their homing instinct no longer works. And they thought, perhaps we can get them to home in on a signal in some way, and therefore you could have radio-controlled pigeons. So why does this matter? Well, why doesn't it matter? The reason is, carrier pigeons are still used for intelligence. Of course, you cannot hack a pigeon. But perhaps more tragically, animals are regularly arrested for spying as part of this modern-day war on terror that we're living through. And a couple of examples up there. 14 squirrels in Iran were arrested in 2007. And a pigeon and a stork were arrested in Egypt this year. There are dozens of other examples. If you search for this online, you will find them. Turns out you can hack a pigeon. Shandong University in 2007 created a remote-controlled pigeon. They wired one up and managed to direct its flight. And perhaps in response to this, the US have been developing a spy pigeon micro-drone that's due to be in service in 2015, though there are rumours that they're already out there. If you'd like to know more about the whole Nazi pigeon fiasco, most of my information comes from the National Archives, the files of MI5, the Special Operations Executive, or MI6, the War Office. I'd also point you to B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviourist who wrote an article, Pigeons in a Pelican, which is all about the pigeon-guided missile project. Also, my own Spy Pigeons dossier that I'm very proud of, that you can download for free, of course, from my website, investigatingtheterror.com. Documentary, Birds of War, very, very funny. Not that educational, but very funny. And a book, Double Cross, The True Story of the D-Day Spies by Ben McIntyre, goes into this in quite a lot of detail as well. And so, to Ben Affleck. Now I know Ben Affleck might strike you as a rather stupid, boring and trivial man, and he certainly is, I agree. But I do think there is a potential subtext here that is worth examining. He is, of course, an American screenwriter, actor, director and producer, very successful one. He's won Oscars and Golden Globes. And it is my contention that he is a CIA agent. A little context for you. The relationship between culture producers and intelligence agencies goes back a long, long time. Ian Fleming, the author of the notorious James Bond novels, was close friends with CIA director Alan Dulles. Indeed, until Ian Fleming referenced the CIA in his books, there was no public admission that it existed. The first public admission came in the James Bond novels. Also, Walt Disney, the famous Walt Disney, was close friends with director of the FBI J. Edgar Hoover. Who knew? Well, if you look up Walt Disney's FBI file, you'll find out. Now, in the United States, this has become formalized. They have what they call entertainment industry liaisons. These are entire offices devoted to the portrayal of military and intelligence agencies in a positive light via the entertainment industry. The Pentagon has had one of these for decades, since at least the 1970s, but the CIA only got on board with this in 1996. A quick look at Affleck's filmography. The first two up there, Armageddon and Pearl Harbor, think they are both catastrophic films that in some way prefigured or foreshadowed the 9/11 attacks. They portrayed this massive, catastrophic, horrible event happening. And both films were made with the cooperation of the Pentagon. The Pentagon's entertainment industry liaisons worked on both of these films. Following 9/11, Affleck made The Sum of All Fears, and much more recently Argo, and both of these films were made with the assistance of the CIA. Even Affleck's wife is possibly a CIA agent. They met in 2003, married in 2005, but of course by that point she was already famous. She's best known for the TV show Alias, which once again is a CIA-assisted production. She also appeared in Pearl Harbor alongside Ben Affleck, and, perhaps most significantly, she starred in a CIA recruitment advert in 2004. This is from a CIA internal publication called What's News at CIA? And this details the Jennifer Garner recruitment video. And you'll notice, about halfway down, it says, Garner was approached by Office of Public Affairs Film Industry Liaison, redacted. They've redacted the name of the person that recruited Jennifer Garner to appear in this recruitment ad. However, we know, from various open source intelligence, that that man was Chase Brandon, this rather Father Christmas looking guy. He was a 35-year CIA veteran. Before he became an entertainment industry liaison, he worked in Black Ops in Latin America, and obviously anyone who knows anything about the history of the CIA in Latin America knows they were up to some very, very ugly stuff. He is a first cousin of the actor Tommy Lee Jones. He was at his wedding. And he was the CIA's first entertainment industry liaison. He served from 1996 to 2007. And just reflect on that time period for a moment. 5 years before 9/11, about the same amount of time after 9/11, this guy was out there trying to get Hollywood and major television organizations to portray the CIA in a very positive light. If we look at Chase Brandon's TV and filmography, we notice a few interesting examples here. First up, Enemy of the State, a film that James Corbett did a podcast on quite recently, pointing out the parallels between the storyline in that, in particular the character played by Gene Hackman, and the Edward Snowden scandal. And in fact, the character played by Gene Hackman is called Edward. He also produced Alias, the show that made Jennifer Garner famous. He also produced The Sum of All Fears, a film that helped make Ben Affleck famous. He also produced The Recruit, which is, in effect, a CIA recruitment film. It is a story about fresh recruits being involved in this dramatic, spying thriller storyline. And this film is actually shown to new CIA recruits while they're on their way to training. He also worked on a made-for-TV movie called Argo Inside Story, which is the same story that Ben Affleck told in the film Argo. Indeed, if we look closely at that document, and we look at the redaction, you'll notice something. Tops of the letters are pointing out. C, H, B, D. They haven't redacted it properly. So this is the final confirmation that lying behind that white strip is the name Chase Brandon, demonstrable through open source intelligence. We can unredact documents. So, to summarize his relationship with the CIA, Ben Affleck became a star via CIA and Pentagon-supported films. Consistently, he worked with them. His wife became a star via a CIA-supported TV show. Both of them worked with the CIA repeatedly, and in particular worked with Chase Brandon, the entertainment industry liaison. If we look at the film Argo, the film that won the Oscar this year, Affleck was the main creative talent. He was the lead actor, he was the director, he was the producer. The film was also produced by George Clooney, who, you may not know, is a signed-up member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a major, possibly the major, foreign policy think tank in the United States, and is very close to the CIA. And in the film, Affleck plays the CIA's man in Hollywood, a guy called Tony Mendez, and he was a disguise and exfiltration expert. He got people out of tight spots, and he worked with Hollywood. He worked with them to create disguises and create costumes for these people that they were trying to get out of somewhere. And in particular, in the film Argo, the CIA, this is a true story, the CIA created a Hollywood film company, a front company, to help them smuggle some embassy staff out of Iran during the Iranian Revolution. And this really happened 30 years ago, and has recently been told in this film. So unsurprisingly, I ask, is Affleck CIA? Well, you don't just have to take my word for it, because a Guardian journalist actually asked him.
Are there many actors in Hollywood who also moonlight as agents, do you think?
I think there are probably quite a few, yes. I think probably Hollywood is full of CIA agents, and we just don't know it. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to discover that, this was extremely common.
Are you a CIA?
I am, yes. And now you've blown my cover, so there goes my career. I just hope the directing thing better work out.
So why does this matter? Again, why doesn't this matter? But the real reason is, most people get their image of the security state, the secret services, the intelligence services, through popular culture. Most people, unlike me, don't really know what they're doing with these things. They don't really know about these institutions. They don't really know what it is they get up to. But at the same time, most people are completely unaware of the entertainment industry liaisons. They're completely unaware of the mechanisms by which the security state manages its own public image. And this process is actually reaching its zenith, it's reaching its peak right now, in that the 2013 Oscars, the Best Picture Oscar, was a fight between the CIA and the CIA. Argo was produced through the CIA's entertainment industry liaison, and so was Zero Dark 30, this account of the Bin Laden raid in Abbottabad in 2011. In fact, there are hundreds of pages of documents on exactly how the CIA assisted in the production of Zero Dark 30. So the Oscars were a competition between two films that were produced, in effect, by the CIA. If you want to know more about this, There's a lot of academic work emerging in this field that I find very, very interesting. Starting with The CIA in Hollywood, a book by Tricia Jenkins. If you want to know more about Ian Fleming and the CIA, I can point you to an essay by Christopher Moran, Ian Fleming and the Public Profile of the CIA. I'd also direct you to the work of Matthew Alford and Robbie Graham. All of these people are doing fantastic work in this field. The seminal book, Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders. You can find this for free online as a PDF, and I strongly, strongly recommend that you read it. I can also recommend the Landscapes of Secrecy project by the University of Warwick. If you just type in Landscapes of Secrecy into your favourite search engine, I'm sure it'll come up. And of course my own website, spyculture.com. So, what connects the Walsall Anarchists, Nazi Pigeons and Ben Affleck? I'd argue they are all great case studies of open source intelligence methods in action, and I hope you'll agree. They are all examples of trends that are still ongoing. The security state is still setting up innocent people and calling them terrorists. They are still hunting down innocent pigeons and calling them terrorists. And they are still manipulating their own public image through the culture industry. I also think these three stories tell us something crucial and vital about the security state. In the first instance, they're morally corrupt. They are happy to fit up innocent people. They are still doing it. They're doing it all the time. The second thing is that they're crazy. They're paranoid. They see enemies everywhere, including in innocent wildlife. And also that they're egoists. They're obsessed with their own public image. They are obsessed with what we think of them. So what is open source intelligence? I would broadly divide it into two different branches. The paper trail, which of course includes diaries, government documents, court records and various other archives, and also the media trail, books, movies, websites, news coverage, academic publications. But in reality, pretty much anything can be used for open source intelligence if you view it in the right way. If you have an inquisitive mind, you can find information. Why is open source intelligence important? I think it's our best tool for investigating the security state. We can't expect government oversight commissions and so on to do this for us, because they're just not interested. Either that, or they're incompetent. Either that, or they're corrupt. It's also important for counterintelligence. We, as citizens who are being monitored and potentially manipulated by these security services, it's important for us to know who their secret agents are, and open source intelligence enables us to do this. Before today, how many people in this room would have thought that Ben Affleck was a CIA agent? But now you all know. I also think open source intelligence is our best tool to resist the paranoia, voyeurism, egoism and sociopathy of the secret services. These are terrible trends, and in some ways terrible times, but there is something we can do about it. And more generally, even beyond the secret services and the security state, I think open source intelligence is our best tool for overcoming institutional secrecy. Just a concluding thought then. If knowledge is power, then the open sourcing of secrets empowers us all. And finally, my websites again, investigatingtheterror.com and spyculture.com. Thank you for listening.